Hey guys, hi, welcome back once again. My name is Vaishali, and having learned quite a few things from, through, and from within human interactions, and having pursued and completed my master's in business administration and in clinical psychology, I today wish to talk about doing hard things and then connecting it with another thought that being happy or that cultivating happiness is actually quite a hard thing to do. Now, for most of us, that may seem counterintuitive. That may even seem a little nonsensical as to how being happy can actually be a hard thing to do. And in order to understand that, let's take up an experiment which I have personally also taken up and have asked a few people to take it up with me as well. So here's the thought with regards to this experiment for those of us who are willing to take it up, which will run for at least 3 days and can be stretched up till 5 or 6 days. So the time we decide to take up this experiment and the time we decide to engage with this experiment for 3 days or 5 or 6 days, what we are essentially required to do is to not have any negative thoughts. Now, for a few people, when I had shared this thing, for them it felt unrealistic, even impossible, while a few others were quite curious to know, to observe, to see. So with regards to this experiment, let's get some more details. Let's get some more nuances into the perspective. Firstly, we are not allowed to have any negative thoughts. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll not have any negative thoughts. Because from the point of evolution, we naturally have a negativity bias, which is what helps us detect threats, which is what helps us detect dangers, which is what helps us survive, which is what helps us defend ourselves, which is what helps us protect ourselves. So that's not saying that we need to overrun our evolutionary bias. But the nuance with regards to this experiment is that as soon as we have any negative thought, we take a note of it. We actually write it down. We actually jot it down. Now that is where we are actually beginning to observe ourselves. We can even jot down the context through which that negative thought came into the picture, came into our head, and our bodies also felt it as a feeling. As and when and whenever we are jotting down these aspects about ourselves, we can even begin to take notice for how long we had this negative thought or these negative thoughts. For how long did we feel them? For how long did we engage with them? And that's actually having a third person's perspective or a second person's perspective on ourselves when we take it just as an observation, when we note it down just as an observation, just as a reaction, without actually claiming it to be good or bad, without actually saying that I failed or I passed. Thirdly, we will not be interacting for the next 3 to 5 or 6 days, whatever the choice we make for ourselves, with others in negative ways. So we'll be trying to hold back our criticism. We'll be trying to hold back our aggression. We'll be trying to hold back our passive aggression. We'll be trying to hold back the ways in which we condescend others. We'll be trying to hold back the times when we begin to blame somebody else or even ourselves. We'll be trying to not shame somebody else or ourselves. We'll be trying to not pass sarcastic remarks. We'll be trying to hold ourselves back whenever we wish to pull down somebody else, to project ourselves in the right light, in the good light. And vice versa as well. We'll not try and pull ourselves down as well, so as to project the idea of being very humble, of being not arrogant, of being holier than thou, of being very righteous. And I've specially used the word projection because many a times we do that as well, to project a certain image of ourselves. so that we come across as more saintly than the other sinners. And over here we may inquire, we may question, we may get curious to ask as to why are we taking up such a weird exercise? As to why are we trying to make happiness and joy so hard? Well, there are actually a few reasons behind it. Firstly, like I mentioned, and like many of us would know, that evolution designed us to have this negativity bias to enable us protect ourselves, to enable us keep us safe, to enable us keep us out of danger and threat. And that evolutionary bias still runs strong across all organisms, which is why we have the 4 survival responses, the 4 survival reactions: fight, fight, flees, or fawn. And quite naturally, if there are these 4 survival instincts that we all have, not just humans, but almost all organisms have in them, at least to some degree, quite naturally, it would take that much more effort, 4 times more effort, to kind of begin to understand, to kind of begin to experience any kind of happiness, any kind of joy, any kind of contentment, any kind of satisfaction, any kind of peace, any kind of fulfillment. Which is where the researcher and the professor in the field of psychology, through her research, has gone on to state, has gone on to mention that it at least takes 3 positive thoughts, 3 positive emotions to counteract 1 negative thought and 1 negative emotion and 1 negative feeling. And the 3 positive thoughts, emotions, and feelings that we need to generate, that we need to curate in order to counterbalance, in order to counteract 1 negative thought, 1 negative feeling, 1 negative emotion, helps us just tip off the edge, is just enough to tip off the edge of the negative thought, negative feeling, and negative emotion. And in a way, it's quite then sensibly telling us that it takes 3 times more effort to tip off, to counterbalance the effect of 1 negative thought, 1 negative feeling, and 1 negative emotion. So in a way, it is actually 3 times more hard work. In a way, it's 3 times more effort to tip off the evolutionary negativity bias, to counterbalance the physiological and the psychological evolutionary negativity bias. The next research from the famous Gottman's lab by John and Julie Gottman, the relationship experts, tells us that within any relationship, within any interaction with the other, we need at least, the word being at least, 5 positive reinforcements or 5 positive interactions to counteract, to counterbalance 1 negative interaction. And that is between 2 people or many people. It takes 5 times more effort to curate, to cultivate a space and environment wherein this can be facilitated. And in a way, if we then logically look at it, quite naturally, staying positive, staying happy is hard work. Observing our own selves as we take note of our own negativity bias is equally hard work, is equally challenging, and yet can help us understand ourselves a little better. Yet can throw light onto the places wherein we probably need to reflect a lot more. to do some internal work. In my understanding, to a degree, if we just have those observations as an observer, as we are taking up this experiment, it in a way helps us take a step back, helps us detach a little bit from our own storylines, from our own narratives. It may even help us question. It may even help us reflect on the thoughts as we note them down, to be able to inquire if those thoughts are absolutely true, if those negative emotions are absolutely true, or have we just gotten too enmeshed with our own opinions, with our own biases, with our own emotions, with our own thoughts, with our own stories, with our own narratives. This experiment might even help us reflect on the kinds of interactions that in a way trigger the negativity bias, that in a way trigger the negatively reactive thoughts, feelings, emotions, and sentiments. It in a way to a degree might also help us observe as to how many times do we have same or similar kinds of negative thoughts, of negative biases, of negative emotions, of negative feelings. It in my understanding to a large degree, if we actually do take up this exercise, would help us get a little more mindful with regards to our own negativity, reactivity. It in a way would slow us down. It in a way would help us reflect. It in a way would help us observe ourselves, take note of our own selves, to do a realistic check, to do a realistic valuation of our own selves. It in my understanding again to some degree would help us vent out all of those negative thoughts, emotions, feelings, and sentiments as we jot them down in our diaries or in our journals, thereby to a large degree, at least in my opinion, freeing a lot of internal space within us, and in a way creating a space inside of us and within our interactions, wherein then we can be a little more thoughtful, wherein then we can be a little more mindful and a lot less reactive. And in my understanding, it may help us develop resiliency as well, because as a lot of research would also tell us, that resiliency is built up gradually over time as we take on some challenging tasks. Challenging which are not overwhelming. Challenging enough to help us move out of our comfort zones. Challenging enough to help us grow and outgrow our own selves, outgrow our own narratives as well. And in my understanding, as the research tells us, that if it takes 3 positive thoughts, minimum 3 positive thoughts, to tip off, to counterbalance 1 negative thought and 5 within our relationships, it naturally is a challenging task. It naturally requires a lot more effort, 3 to 5 times more effort, and thereby it naturally requires us to do the hard work. And doing any kind of hard work naturally builds resilience. So I'll be taking up this task for myself starting today, and I'll be taking it up minimum for 3 days. And if I'm able to sustain it for 3 days, maintain it for 3 days, I'll probably try and push myself, if it doesn't feel draining, onto the 4th and the 5th day as well, to get a little more self-aware, to get a little more mindful, to get a little more responsive than be reactive, to get a little more observant and curious about my own narratives, about my own stories, about my own opinions, about my own thoughts, about my own beliefs, about my own values. And I know that even if I take it up for 3 days and do it diligently, do it without taking shortcuts or without cheating myself, I will outgrow myself to some degree. I will become a little more resilient, at least to some degree, would enhance my self-esteem, my self-worth, at least on some degree. So I'd be interested to know if you would be willing to take that exercise for yourself, to take this exercise for yourself. If you'd be interested to take up the hard work of building up resiliency, of curating happiness, of cultivating self-reflection, of being more responsive than being more reactive, and of cultivating mindfulness practices. Let me have your take on that, and I will see you once again the next week. Till then, stay tuned in. And guys, if you do like the contextual content of these videos, please do like, share, and subscribe.